Hello everybody and welcome to one of those videos where I read the Future of the Fortress posts on Bay 12 Games. This is the monthly Q&A about Dwarf Fortress that Tarn Adams does to forum users. If you want to take part in these posts, there is a link in the description. They come out on the first of every month. It's going to be a lot of reading, so let's dive in. Now before you panic, he doesn't mean last ever, just most recent. So, 4 days. Here's the last Bay 12 report to start December, and the last Future of the Fortress Q&A reply. And here's the latest Steam news. The Dwarf Fortress soundtrack has been released in various places. Links in the news, also in the description of this video, to the Bandcamp specifically, where you can buy it. I've also posted the beginnings of a modding guide, and I'll add a bit to that as we go, also in the description of this video. So let's dive into the report. Mission status. And Three Toe writes, have you ever looked up at the moon and said, everything I worked on since I was 5 years old, 42 years ago, is culminating with the press of a button into a pass-fail judgment of your entire life's work? Of course you haven't, and neither have I. I keep my emotions under control, as stress finds its way into my nightmares and robs my brain of the ability to make good decisions. So, I hope, for the whole team's sake, that you press that button. Congratulations to the generous. Three Toe. Thank you, Zach. And Tarn writes, thanks to everybody who helped out in November. Yeah, here we go. Dwarf Fortress releases on Steam and itch December 6th. This should be fun. Another thank you to all of the people that have gotten us to this point. As you can see, there's been a little bit of a drop-off since October in their monthly finances, but still holding strong. Considering, remember this is funding 2 people, not including taxes and other life fees. Still, they're doing all right and about to probably do better than they've ever done before. They also talk about whether or not they'll be including the Steam sales income numbers in these next month in the future questions. So we'll get into that when we get to it. But still holding strong from that boost they got a good couple months ago. Before we dive in, it is also worth noting that there was a large AMA done on the subreddit that Tarn Adams took part in. If you want to take a look at that, there's also a link to that in the description of this video. First question comes in from Kills, and they say, what is the state of keyboard control in Dwarf Fortress, and what are the plans for it going forward? And Tarn's response is, yeah, we have hotkeys for the top-level actions, and an optional cursor that you can turn on for designations and buildings, and macros work with these things. Keyboard support for other menus will take time, but we'd like to get to them. Next one comes in from Volleylol, and they say, are the vanilla RAWs split into multiple zipped folders going forwards? Or was the vanilla buildings example just an example? And Tarn's response is, they are in multiple unzipped folders with their own info.txts. All within the data vanilla folder. All and some of them can be removed from the load order when you create a world. The next question comes in from Kriparum, and they say, I personally think that $30 is a good price for such an awesome game, but people in the Russian community ask about possible region prices. And Tarn's response is, KitFox says they'll be following Steam's guidelines on this. I'm not sure if we have those numbers or if it'll all set automatically. A next question comes in from an Obsidian Short Sword, and they say, this may have been asked before, but how much test coverage does your code have in 2022? And Tarn's response is, I can't feasibly support anything like expensive unit tests, but I have some things like that scattered around in places that are accident prone. The next question comes from Bread and Roses, and they say, how moddable will DF be with workshop support? Will people be able to change core features of the game, different farming mechanics and different combat mechanics, and new systems, etc.? Or will it be limited to using the modules already in the engine? And since Tarn quotes Volleylol in this discussion, I'm going to read their post first. And they say, from what we've heard, it will be easier for mods to work together, but the extent of what's moddable hasn't changed. And Tarn's response is, yeah, it's basically the same as before, with objects, etc. Steam Workshop doesn't provide any extra capabilities on its own, and I haven't been able to create a giant API or anything. Another question from the main character of this episode, Volleylol, and they say, Will you include earnings from the premium version in the monthly Bay 12 reports? It's hard to speak for others, but I know I would appreciate the transparency. Also, if it hasn't been disclosed by this point, the start of December, will DF Classic and ASCII be made ready at premium launch? And Tarn's response is, I think there may still be Steam rules against certain data releases, so I'm not really sure. Tanya has been talking about potential sales numbers a bit on Twitter and such, so it seems like we may be able to release some data. Because of how the wheels turn at Steam internally, we won't have any precise earnings numbers until mid-February, but we should have rough sales numbers very quickly. As you've probably seen, Classic is shortly after launch now, basically the next thing I'm working on, and there is just a few things to clean up. I can't predict what's going to happen with sudden issues and etc. after launch, since it'll be a whole new universe. But if things are settled quickly, it shouldn't take very long. The conversion is mostly done. There are just a few display issues. The title screen and world maps and buildings don't print, and the sky looks weird, and a few buttons don't show. Now, this is a multi-parter, so there's going to be a lot of flipping back and forth, and this comes in from Urist McSaddist, and they say, will non-grazing animals require food before magic? And Tarn's response is, there's nothing particularly pointing in that direction before magic. We'd probably need similar portions for the little beasts. Saddist's second question is, right now, adventure mode is basically unplayable in big cities. Will we get the option to add a population cap to sites? And Tarn's response is, it's something we'll be looking at again when we get adventure mode updated. I'm not sure what the outcome will be. Depends on how regular optimizations go. Saddist's third question is, will gods have personalities after magic? And Tarn's response to the third question is, it seems probably that there will be some distinctions drawn for the creation of myth generator. And Saddist's final question is, what can we expect the villains to do in our forts once the villain update is done? And Tarn's response is, the existing world gen plots beyond the artifact heists include assassinations, embezzlement, sabotage, and coups. So that kind of thing I'd expect. Sabotage, of course, in the fort setting could lead to all sorts of troublesome behaviors. The next one comes in from A Curious Cat, and they say, I watched the new video by KitFox on YouTube, and I've got a question. I've noticed that in the game doesn't pause when smaller screens pop up. Will it be possible to move the screens around on the screen so they don't cover up what you don't want them to cover up? And Tarn's response is, they are not currently movable. This seems possible though. You can have various things open at once, and overlaps are really not handled well by the engine. So we'd have to make sure they can't cross each other. Next, we have another multi-parter. This one comes in from the illustrious Crabman, so we're going to do the previous flip back and forthy thingy. The first part is, might creatures, particularly forgotten beasts made of fluid, gas, or powder, get buffed before the big weight? Seeing as how they're really fragile and a bit underwhelming, despite monsters like this in fantasy often being extra dangerous and hard to kill. And Tarn's response is, I don't know. There's a lot to do, and it's a very specific sort of thing. But yeah, something does need to happen. Crabman's second part of this question is, will it be possible for off-site world gen combat calculations to be made more accessible at some point? Outside of the literally viewing the battle with a second camera thing that's planned for after the map rewrite. According to what I've heard from others, basically nothing factors into the outcome but the combat skills, size, and the leader's tactical skills. Basically, none of their special abilities or comparative body material durability matters. And the battles are all a sequence of 1v1s, so the sheer numbers can't overwhelm an opponent. But, at best, being extra dice rolls for one individual to get lucky and strike in. And Tarn's response is, sure, it's possible, but we have to be careful about a lot of things since we don't have an easy access to unit definitions and can't use any CPU time on it. And the third and final part of Crabman's question, and they say, are animated world map tiles in the plans for post-release graphics enhancements? Stuff like moving waters and rivers. those sparkles in the good-aligned biome forests actually sparkling in a heat haze for hot biomes, etc. And Tarn's response is, we don't have any particular plans for it. The world map is caught between several different uses, and it probably needs a different print mode for each one. The next is another multi-parter, this one I've split up, from Urist McWider Shins. And they ask, will the world gen rewrite and myths and magic include constellations and possessions of the equinoxes? It would be really cool to have, say, the astrological age of the shoe cobbler, and with the cavy pig apocalypse, for so it was written in the beginning, for example. It would also give all my astronomers more stuff to do. And Tarn's response is, we have some of these notions in the knowledge and scholar side of the game already, but they don't mean anything in the game. We know stars exist from adventure mode, and I'm all for playing around with it, but it's uncertain when these things will advance. We have the notes about conjunctions and other magical happenings and such, and they are somewhat appealing because they are pretty easy to do by themselves. And their second part of the question is, the tropics and subtropics should be very nice to have, rather than the random distribution of deserts and jungles, even if the implementation it was quick and dirty, so to speak. Any plans to include that? And trade winds. Oh, I can see how this would affect boats and trade. And Tarn's response is, trade winds, etc. haven't been relevant yet, so I haven't spent much time on the wind model. Distribution of deserts and jungles isn't entirely random. It depends on rain shadows and latitude currently, though the overall rain distribution is randomized at first since the weather model doesn't give us much to work with. I expect it to be better around the time we get to boats. And the third part of their question. A recent combat log included the text, a forgotten beast bit off Urist McDwarf baby's head, and the part went flying in an arc. The severed part when sailed off in an arc. Come on, get your wording right. Infant mortality being what it is in Dwarf Fortress, will there be artwork for dead dwarven infants or infant body parts? Or will changes have to be made now that the game is being published and distributed to a wider audience than before? And Tarn's response is, we haven't drawn living babies yet, and are hoping to get to that soon. I'm not too concerned about this. They have Dead Spark in Ultima 7, and I think we'd be at about that level. I guess, if you're unlucky, you could get an intestine drag. This doesn't bother me at all, but I guess we'll see what happens. And now a question from Buttery Mess, and they say, what sort of FPS does the new version run at? And have there been optimizations made to make it faster? Tale as old as time. And can you limit the fort's population size from inside the game now, rather than having to do it through the init files? For that matter, have most of the modifiable values which affect gameplay, which were located in the init and dinit files, been put into the main game? And Tarn's response is, it's a bit faster, compiler upgrade really helped as usual. And yes, you can set almost all of the init and dinit options from inside the game now. There are some things, like additional font support, we still have to do in some way or another. We were somewhat aware of that if you look back through our comments regarding pathfinding, but the 20% going to some kind of cage versus not cage or whatever definitely has to be investigated. Fortunately, we've been in the discussion with Putnam on this kind of thing, and hopefully progress will be made. I don't see it there, but I think the typical item temperature, etc. stuff also came up. In any case, yeah, you have to go to where the slowdowns actually are and fix them. A two-parter, which I'm going to read in one dump, from Shonai Dweller, and they say, you mentioned in the interview the other day that 200 or so animal people don't have layers info in their graphics RAWs to show clothing and hairstyles and such visually. There's a lot of data, so that seems reasonable. Presumably, there's no hard-coded restrictions on adding these ourselves in mods, for those of us who play in worlds where rat people are far more important than elves. Or will we run into issues with Elephant Men helmets? Is this something you consider as needed for releasing in adventure mode? Since surely no one ever plays parties consisting entirely of dwarves, elves, humans, and goblins. Guilty. Apologies if this has all been answered before. Been in hibernation while the arc gets done. And Tarn quotes Volleylol, so I'm going to read their comment first. And Volleylol says, "From my understanding, the creature variation templates will continue to be only for creatures in the upcoming release, instead of being generalized for all sorts of objects. I imagine this is some technical issue, but on which level? And if it ends up being extended and replaced by something more general, do you think it could work on graphics tokens as well? Admittedly, a bit suggestion-y, but I think it could shorten the graphics files quite a lot using the argument functionality." And Tarn's response to the whole thing is, "You should be able to do it, yeah. It's just a ton of effort and art and such. Especially if you want profession-based colors and specific items and all that. Some middle ground would be easier to accomplish. I'm not sure if a full conversion would also hit a tech barrier. It's just a ton of data. In the vein, we may also attempt a middle ground ourselves. They already have fake clothing, but it would be nice to at least see weapons. And yeah, we haven't generalized creature variations, and it's not so much a tech issue per se, as it's a time issue. It's something I should be able to do, generalizing the post-load text changing stuff. And now that all of the definitions are just sitting around before they are all finalized. And presumably, using some kind of template, etc., would work for graphics to some extent. It gets complicated because you need to give tile purges and positions, and those aren't always consistent. And there are larger than 1x1, and some aren't, etc. But, in principle, yeah, there's a lot of compression that could be done, even within the single dwarf definition I'm using. The next question comes in from a Mr. Crabman, and they say, "Are duplicated RAWs still a problem, or will mods in the loading order that are the same ID for an object, example, a creature, replace and overwrite the definitions in previous mods?" And 2, is there a way to disable and toggle certain raw files within a mod package from the workshop? For example, after downloading More Creatures mod from the workshop and having some in-game menu that lets you toggle, say, amphibians off, but keep the mod's birds. Or alternatively, are there some other solutions that allows a single workshop subscription page to contain what is technically multiple mods, so that granular mods don't have to post a million entries to the workshop? And Tarn quotes Eric Blank, so I will read their response first. "I had the same concern. Several people specifically asked me to add mod support for removing certain features from the mod I'm curating, which I did by splitting it into multiple parts, as well as a single all-in-one version. With the Steam release, will this modularity be possible from a single download now? Example, uploading multiple object folders within the same Steam mod and disabling the ones you don't want?" And Tarn's response is, "We discussed this, cut, etc. in your future post. And there's nothing like that. We're open to expanding what the system can handle, especially to overcome non-ideal situations like the one you describe. But it was only so much time we could devote up to this point. With the changes to loading we've made for a select and etc. stuff, where all mods exist in a text space before they are processed. I think it should be easier, at least. I'm optimistic. We can get into a good place here. Though, I'm not sure if we'll need to eat the full scripting pill first, or just keep burying ourselves in esoteric syntax. This causes a bit of inertia, since it's not something I have a lot of experience with." A question comes in from Lubum, and they say, "How long has the changelog grown to? I'm presuming you've managed to keep one this whole time." And Tarn's response is, "I did not. It just didn't feel feasible at this time, and circumstances were much stranger, so I set myself free of it. Changelogs will be kept up on again after launch." A question comes in from a randomizer, and they say, "When will caravans become more selective in the items they are willing to buy, as well as the prices they put on items? They would act as real traders other than garbage collectors. They have a list of what they want and what they will accept. They may be convinced to take other stuff if it is of high quality and rare, however. How far off is the improved mechanics update? Feasible trap mechanisms, springs, gears, ropes, pulleys, piping, conveyor belts, and maybe rock crushers and hydraulics. And Tarn's response is, I assume when we do the economy stuff after the Civ update, after the Magic update, we'll see a very different trade system. I'm not sure what changes we'll make before then, since we just don't have enough information about resources and production. A next question comes in from an elf lord, seems sus, and they say, you had said Villains Part 2, a fort takeover could happen. Would you shed some more light on what this entails, and how the fort behaves afterwards? Does it become some big, bad HQ afterwards? Will villains use it as their base for future operations? And Tarn's response is, it isn't particularly planned out, but would be pretty frustrating if a villain pulls off a coup and you just lose, since it would be a hidden thing you didn't catch. Kind of like if a vampire could simultaneously gobble everybody at once, so it makes sense to let you carry out in some capacity. The counterpoint here is that you might not have as many commands, and hopefully it wouldn't be too little or irritating to play. So we're just exploring the idea right now. And as you suggest, the AI for villains would have to be expanded significantly for whatever aspects of the fort you aren't running. And that's another issue. At the same time, once you have this capacity, you could play something like a dwarf gang working down in a human sewer and have it kinda work, which would be pretty funny. A question from friend of the show, Rickelbert, and they say, will we be able to visually identify wild plants, or will we still need the mouse to select them? Will we be able to see specific weapons in a trap? With the recent balance changes to farming, have you considered making greenhouses from glass and roofs and walls? How do we identify the differences between animals and their savage giant cousins? Do they have different art, or are they larger than a single tile? Are there any beasts and titans that will take up more than one tile, or is that something that you're not interested in doing? And what time will the game actually release? Is it a rolling release where every time zone gets access to it at midnight, or some other time, or a global release where everyone gets it at insert time slot here? And Tarn's response says, as an update to Volleylol's reply, which was the current at the time, we will now have outdoor plant graphics for launch, and we still need to do products and maybe differentiate certain crops, example, wheats, and perhaps differentiate between shrubs, such as usable growths and shrubs that are out of season or already picked, but it's much more varied outside now. And yes, weapon and traps show differences in weapon, but they don't currently reflect multiple weapons. Greenhouses would take a bit of work for the game to understand. Wikipedia puts them slightly out of date in the mid-1400s as well. And giant animals have much inflated tiles, but as Crabman says, it's all visual and not mechanical. There are lots of problems to overcome in implementing actual multi-tile creatures. And I'm not sure how releases will work on Steam. We have one button that says that we press this and releases the game, as I understand it. My assumption is that this would be everywhere at once, but if Steam's internal workings make it function differently, I don't know. Another question from Randomizer, and they say, what will happen in the new version if you kill off the original dwarf caravan in the first year, as in a drowning chamber? Prolonged war? Will you ever get another dwarven caravan? Perhaps from a different dwarven civilization? And Tarn's response is, you still can't fight your own civilization. There are technical issues with that we have to overcome at some point. Generally, diplomacy and such needs need to be improved for it to feel at all proper between your fort and any other civs. The next questions come in from Xenon, and they say, I'm very excited about the upcoming changes to difficulty of trading and farming in the Steam release, as balance and challenges has always been a big interest of mine. Are there plans down the road to similarly tweak other systems with an eye for balance? Example, changing how easy it is to feed a fortress via trees, or fishing certain combat options like cage traps having outsized effectiveness? Similarly, with the eventual Army and Siege update down the line, are there any plans on relating the consistency and relative strength of a Goblin Siege? I know it was only a gamey stopgap to measure at the time, but but one aspect I appreciated about the old Goblin Siege mechanics in the pre-0.4x days was reliably knowing a Goblin Siege would show up in the first years of new forts, if listed as a neighbor. And subsequent sieges would usually be roughly proportional to your fort's wealth and size, regardless of what other things may have been going on in the world. And Tarn's response is, yeah, we'll see some big changes when we get to the siege stuff for sure. And it's always worked this way. We've rebalanced the formulas for launch, but there's an overriding trouble population. If the goblins don't have the people, they can't send them, and we're always going to have to work around that going forward. Really, if you've killed most of the possible goblin invaders, and humans and elves and others should probably be filling the vacuum. Or if something horrid could happen, I don't want it to be too gamey. Of course, we never really came to terms with the opening of the underworld, and now that should impact all subsequent games around the world generally. There's a lot to work with, I think. Another question comes in from Dick Butt DeGrot, and they say, so is orange confirmed being a new color in Classic? I was looking at some of the screenshots you had hosted of the new Classic mode recently, and I noticed a color difference. And Tarn's response is, we changed the 16 colors RGB files to make troublesome ones like dark blue not so unreadable, especially against the non-black background of Premium. These colors will still be available to change. Next question comes in from Julius Klonkus, and they say, now that we've got a listen to the soundtrack, I want to preface my question with reassurances that the amount of ambient tracks are absolutely amazing, and I'll probably listen to them when I go to sleep later. At the same time, the vocal tracks, like Drinkin' Industry, are very clearly upgraded Kogan-san, and have given me goosebumps in a wholly different level. Assuming there are no hidden surprises on the music front for the release, what are the chances of other vocal tracks such as Tankard Basher or Danger Room, or even more all-new tracks finding their way into future updates? I want an Adventure Mode soundtrack stat. And Tarn's response is, I'm all for more work in this direction. Those are Simon's tracks, of course, and he worked on the Dwarf Fortress versions with Dabu. And it all depends on availability and the success of the launch and all that sort of thing. I love the new music though, and would gladly see more. And yeah, we can hopefully officially support streaming music mods as well, and there are some tech barriers to overcome there. Most of the load time at the beginning of the game is prepping the music, and more music is more prep. Whether or not it happens, but it can definitely be done. Now one that I won't understand from Crabman, and they say, I'm guessing the answer is yes, but is there a cut creature / select creature equivalent for all object types, including the graphics defining stuff and creature variations? And what happens if one unit is cut X tag or select X on the object wasn't defined yet? For example, if cut creature dwarf, but the user disabled vanilla raws has no other mod defining dwarf beforehand, would select creature, undefined creature, silently not do anything, or would it create the thing on the spot? I have no idea what any of that meant. And Tarn's response is, we have cut and select for most objects, but we don't have it for the graphics side yet. I think cut and select calls for non-existent objects to quietly fall. Creating objects by default with select seems kind of dangerous, since it would be empty and might not be filled by the calling mod. That brings us to the end of this month's Future in the Fortress read-along. If you enjoy these and you like listening to my voice, I recommend checking my podcast. It can be found at www.halcyonfrequency.com or on podcast platforms of your choice underneath the Halcyon Frequency podcast. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you like the sound of my voice and want to support me directly, you can do that via Patreon or via YouTube members. If you want to see my face as I play video games, mostly Dwarf Fortress, on Twitch, you can find me at twitch.tv/BLINDIRL. Thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one.